Book 1. European Nihilism. Nihilism. Because nihilism represents the ultimate logical conclusion of our great values and ideals, because we must experience nihilism before we can find out what value these values really had, we require, sometime, new values. Morality was the great antidote against practical and theoretical nihilism. Conclusion: the faith in the categories of reason is the cause of nihilism. We have measured the value of the world according to categories that refer to a purely fictitious world. Final conclusion: all the values by means of which we have tried so far to render the world estimable for ourselves, and which then proved inapplicable and therefore devaluated the world, all these values are, psychologically considered, the results of certain perspectives of utility, designed to maintain and increase human constructs of domination, and they have been falsely projected into the essence of things. What we find here is still the hyperbolic naivete of man, positing himself as the meaning and measure of the value of things. Pessimism is not a problem but a symptom, that the name should be replaced by nihilism, that the question whether not to be is better than to be is itself a disease, a sign of decline, an idiosyncrasy. There is no solidarity in a society in which there are sterile, unproductive, and destructive elements which, incidentally, will have descendants even more degenerate than they are themselves. The valuation that is today applied to the different forms of society is entirely identical with that which assigns a higher value to peace than to war, but this judgment is anti-biological, is itself a fruit of the decadence of life. Life is a consequence of war, society itself a means to war. As a biologist, Mr. Herbert Spencer is a decadent. As a moralist, too, he considers the triumph of altruism a desideratum. The race is corrupted not by its vices but by its ignorance. It is corrupted because it did not recognize exhaustion as exhaustion. Mistakes about physiological states are the source of all ills. How did the exhausted come to make the laws about values? Put differently, how did those come to power who are the last? How did the instinct of the human animal come to stand on its head? 2. History of European Nihilism. The emancipation of science from moral and religious purposes, a very good sign that, however, is usually misunderstood. In my own way I attempt a justification of history. What is attacked deep down today is the instinct and the will of tradition. All institutions that owe their origins to this instinct violate the taste of the modern spirit. One considers tradition a fatality, one studies it, recognizes it, as heredity, but one does not want it. Will to truth. The modern spirit's lack of discipline, dressed up in all sorts of moral fashions. The showy words are, tolerance, for the incapacity for yes and no, the breadth of sympathy, equals 1/3 indifference, 1/3 curiosity, 1/3 pathological irritability, objectivity, lack of personality, lack of will, incapacity for love, freedom versus rules, romanticism, truth versus forgery and lies, naturalism, being scientific, the document humane, in other words, the novel of colportage and addition in place of composition, passion meaning disorder and immoderation, depth meaning confusion, the profuse chaos of symbols. Ideals: this is my pessimism, to have recognized how the higher feelings are a source of misfortune and man's loss of value. One is deceived every time one expects progress from an ideal. Every time so far, the victory of the ideal has meant a retrograde movement. Christianity, the revolution, the abolition of slavery, equal rights, philanthropy, love of peace, justice, truth, all these big words have value only in a fight, as flags, not as realities but as showy words for something quite different, indeed, opposite. To understand all is to forgive all. Hegel's way of thinking is not far different from Goethe's. One needs only to listen to Goethe about Spinoza. Will to deify the universe and life in order to find repose and happiness in contemplation and in getting to the bottom of things. Hegel seeks reason everywhere. Before reason one may submit and acquiesce. In Goethe a kind of almost joyous and trusting fatalism that does not revolt, that does not flag, that seeks to form a totality out of himself, in the faith that only in the totality everything redeems itself and appears good and justified. The 17th century seeks in art, a piece of culture. The 18th uses art to make propaganda for reforms of a social and political nature. Utopia, the ideal man, the deification of nature, the vanity of posing, the subordination to propaganda for social goals, charlatanism, these are our gifts from the 18th century. Not the corruption of man but the extent to which he has become tender and moralized is his curse. Feelings about values are always behind the times. They express conditions of preservation and growth that belong to times long gone by. They resist new conditions of existence with which they cannot cope and which they necessarily misunderstand. Thus, they inhibit and arouse suspicion against what is new. Every fruitful and powerful movement of humanity has also created at the same time a nihilistic movement. It could be the sign of a crucial and most essential growth, of the transition to new conditions of existence, that the most extreme form of pessimism, genuine nihilism, would come into the world. The inversion of the order of rank, the pious counterfeiters, the priests, among us become chandellas. They replace the charlatans, quacks, counterfeiters, and wizards. We consider them corrupters of the will, great slanderers of life on which they wish to revenge themselves, rebels among the underprivileged. We have turned the caste of servants, the Sudras, into our middle class, our vote people, those who make political decisions. On the other hand, the Chandala of former times is at the top, foremost, those who blaspheme God, the immoralists, the nomads of every type, the artists, Jews, musicians at bottom, all disreputable classes of men we have raised ourselves to the level of honorable thoughts. Vermensklilik/Zung, our becoming more humane, is the only thing worthy of being considered genuine progress, and it consists in spiritualizing Vergeistigen, the senses instead of condemning them as evil. One return to nature understood more and more decisively in the opposite sense from Rousseau's. Away from idol and opera. Two, more and more decisively anti-idealistic, more concrete, more fearless, industrious, moderate, suspicious against sudden changes, anti-revolutionary. Three, more and more decisively the question concerning the health of the body is put ahead of that of the soul, the latter being understood as a state consequent upon the former, and the former at the very least as a precondition of the health of the soul. The German word for pity, Mitleid, means literally suffering with like compassion and sympathy. Good society consists of those whom at bottom nothing interests except what is forbidden in bourgeois society and gives a bad reputation. The same applies to books, music, politics, and the estimation of woman. We are coarser, more direct, full of irony against generous feelings even when we succumb to them. More natural is our first society, that of the rich, the leisure class. They hunt each other. Love between the sexes is a kind of sport in which marriage furnishes an obstacle and a provocation. They amuse themselves and live for pleasure. They esteem physical advantages above all, are curious and bold. We consider nothing great unless it includes a great crime. More natural is our attitude toward nature. We no longer love it on account of its innocence, reason, or beauty. We have made it nicely devilish and dumb. There are signs that the European of the 19th century is less ashamed of his instincts. He has taken a goodly step toward admitting to himself his unconditional naturalness, i.e., his immorality, without becoming embittered, on the contrary, strong enough to endure only the sight. The instincts of decadence should not be confused with humaneness. 104 The means of civilization, which lead to disintegration and necessarily to decadence, should not be confused with culture. Socialism is on the whole a hopeless and sour affair, and nothing offers a more amusing spectacle than the contrast between the poisonous and desperate faces cut by today's socialists and to what wretched and pinched feelings their style bears witness, and the harmless lamb's happiness of their hopes and desiderata. One must want to have more than one has in order to become more. In the doctrine of socialism there is hidden, rather badly, a will to negate life. The human beings or races that think up such a doctrine must be bungled. Indeed, I should wish that a few great experiments might prove that in a socialist society life negates itself, cuts off its own roots. Socialism will be able to be something useful and therapeutic. It delays peace on earth and the total mollification of the democratic herd animal. It forces the Europeans to retain spirit, namely cunning and cautious care, not to abjure manly and warlike virtues altogether, and to retain some remnant of spirit, of clarity, sobriety, and coldness of the spirit. It protects Europe for the time being from the marasmus femininus that threatens it. Your equity, you higher natures, impels you toward suffrage universal, etc., your humanity, toward mildness confronted with crime and stupidity. In the long run you thus make stupidity and the unscrupulous victorious, comfort and stupidity the mean.